Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Nemeth Report podcast. I'm Dr. Tammy Nemeth, energy historian, analyst, consultant, and I'll be your host. Today, it's my absolute pleasure to be joined by Dr. David Zarek, a retired professor, environmental health risk analyst, and science communicator extraordinaire, who is currently the editor of the Firebreak. Our conversation promises to be quite wide-ranging and will cover elements of the net zero climate lawfare, the foundation funding, and even climate disclosures. So please stay with us. Hopefully we won't run on too long, but I think it'll be great fun. Hi, Paul. Welcome to the program.
Hi, Tammy. Thanks for having me.
You know, you have quite a background, a huge wealth of experience, very interesting doctoral dissertation, I must say. And I'm wondering if you can just take a moment to introduce yourself to the audience and tell us about your most recent project, the Firebreak.
Well, it's been a long haul, I think, over the last 4 decades. I got myself involved in risk at a time when nobody was really doing risk communications, or what was also an emerging field called science communications. To go back to the 90s and realize all the sort of crises that we had, from mad cow disease to the the MMR vaccine to acrylamide in potato chips, to realize that we were not very good at managing risks. And so I was part of an emerging field of maybe around 10 people, most of them philosophers, trying to understand why people will take facts and when they get mixed with emotions, make decisions that are rather strange. Fast forward to COVID, and we realize we still haven't really learned how to manage a risk, or what regulatory risk management actually is about. So I was working in the chemical industry back then, Solvay. I know I'm going to go to hell when I die, but anyway. And I worked a lot with toxicologists who taught me quite a bit as well about the scientific approach to risk management. And I set up, after leaving Solvay, I went into the academe, but I also set up a blog site because I had to teach my students on social media in the early 2000s. I set up a blog called The Riskmonger, and it was meant to sort of be a satirical approach to how people make risk decisions. But it also started to get into the whole risk management approach and looking at how the NGOs are sort of continually buggering things. I retired from the academe 2 years ago and decided that I had to look more at how the NGOs were taking and controlling a lot of the narratives on environmental health risk management and environmental health risk communications. And so the Firebreak started as an idea to say, well, the media seems to be reporting all of this almost like they were activists themselves. And as I started to peel back the onions, I started to realize how much foundations were funding the media, and the foundations were funding the same NGOs, and the amount of foundation wealth that was sloshing around. Well, there's just not enough hours in the day for all the things that we would like to publish on this stuff.
Well, for sure. And you guys have done such a great job just starting to roll it out because, as you say, it's there's so much out there, particularly those interconnections between the foundations funding media, then the media doing these positive stories on the groups that are also, funded by these foundations. And I highly recommend people check out the Firebreak. You just have such a great selection of stories in there. Um, before we move on, I'm wondering if you could maybe try to give us a sense of why you think the NGOs ended up in this sort of policy making apparatus where they're involved in these discussions at a policy level. They produce reports to policymakers that is then used in order to change regulations or develop policies. Why do you think the NGOs came to hold these quite influential positions?
Well, I came out of industry, and it was rather industry would always employ the brightest and the best. If you have a scientist who's on to some discovery, they will be recruited. They'll do an internship probably in an industry, and they will they will actually go in and do work and go forward. Industry structure is one that you can get promoted and you can follow different paths of promotion quite well. And so to leave industry is to leave a sort of structure that's already in place. What happens to the people who aren't that bright in universities? Okay, well, they don't go into industry. They don't get hired, and they find other activities. Many of them go in to the social sphere, particularly working for NGOs, particularly if they're a bit angry about things, like not getting a job that pays the rent. Sorry, I digress. But the interesting element there is that once you're in a nonprofit structure, it's rather flat. And you could be at the top of your organization by the time you're mid 30s. Then what? Where did the ambitious ones go after that? Well, they go into government because the government is just an extension of the sort of policy campaigning that you were doing in an NGO. So a lot of what we've noticed is a lot of people leaving. They talk about the revolving door from industry into government. Well, that almost never happens. Quite simply, anyone who's worked in a well-structured company would just get so frustrated working in government after a few months, unless they feel it as a moral duty to do it as after years of service. So a lot of people leave the NGOs and go into different policymaking bodies. Particularly, one of the more interesting ones is the UN bodies like UNEP or the WHO, which, if you just walk down the hallway, you can sort of see the former NGO logos still kind of on posters on the walls behind their desks. And so you're getting a lot of people who have come out of years of campaigning now turning their campaigning into something akin to policymaking.
That's a really great summary of how they end up in, especially in those multilateral institutions like the UN. And I'm wondering if part of this is there's a few components. Number one, this idea that business is bad. Business should not be allowed to have a say because they're corrupt or whatever, in how the policies and regulations are made. And then there's also the shift to this stakeholder inclusion. But it seems that not all stakeholders are considered equal. So, if we talk about stakeholder capitalism, what exactly does that mean? And what does it mean to include all these different stakeholders in the sort of sausage making of policy? But some voices, of course, are preferenced over others. Or if you get, 10 or 12 NGOs around a table and one industry representative, what's going to win out? That industry voice, or even if there's someone there who's a voice of reason, they're diluted because around the table is all these other stakeholders who seem to have more importance.
Well, I mean, the hypocrisy is rich here. When I got started in the 90s, there wasn't even a word for stakeholder. I think we started talking about stakeholder dialogue around, well, it was actually being defined around Rio in 92.
Yeah.
But it wasn't until the early 2000s that I started an organization called Green Facts, which was meant to take a science communication approach to environmental issues, and we wanted it to be multi-stakeholder. And I can remember we would have a hard time. I was working in French a lot of the time. We would have a hard time with a French person who didn't really understand how to translate the word stakeholder. Is it partie prenante? It didn't make sense. So it wasn't even a word, and in fact, in French now it's les stakeholders. So it's so it's a word that we've only had for the last 20 plus years. But what does it mean? Well, in the 90s, there was a lot of talk, and you go back to the European Commission wrote a white paper on governance, where they realized that the real problem of trust in government policy had a lot to do with the fact that there were these backroom deals made, that industry was getting together with policymakers, and they would determine most policy then was industrial policy in any case. And so after all of the risk crises of the 90s that I mentioned earlier, there was suddenly this need to create a more engaged, participatory approach to the policy process. So we started to find ways to invite stakeholders to the table. We had different mechanisms within the European Union at the time to do this. And so it worked for a little while until the NGOs kind of realized or wondered if they were just there to make the system legitimized. And so they started to put greater demands. That's why today there's a lot of funding of NGOs, because the first thing that says, well, we don't have money to come to all these meetings and be, pose as your sort of, authoritative cross-party group. So we started giving money to them, and then they started getting stronger, and they started wondering, well, we can't have a debate with groups that we find are trying to corrupt the system. So industry started to become sort of not welcome. We started to notice, in fact, I actually I was a rapporteur for a study on how to get NGOs and scientists to work together. And one of the alternatives, one of the ideas was, well, if NGOs won't participate or won't be involved, why don't we give the money to the NGOs and let them do the events, or they will do the reports. In the end, they just invited all of their friends and excluded everybody else. So that was probably not the best idea.
Of course.
But today we have something, and this has a lot to do with this, what I would call an onslaught. An onslaught is an attack on all fronts of all industries, and it's frightening because I basically referred to most industries as the second slowest zebra. So today the lion is munching into the slowest zebra, and the rest of the herd can just continue grazing like nothing is wrong. And so when the tobacco industry was being obviously demonized, some would say for good reason, but what happened was the rest of industry stood back and allowed it. But it created then a playbook, which I refer to as tobacconization, which is to discredit industry from a PR point of view, continue to march outside their offices, continue to attack the reputation of these companies, continue to constantly do and pay scientists to find some chemical elements in a food additive, for example, of a company's product, and get the lawyers involved, continually how should I say, sue them out of existence. And it actually, there's a concept, it's called adversarial regulation, which several American scientists, former regulatory scientists like Bernie Goldstein and Christopher Portier created. And they've got documents where they've written about how it's far better than the precautionary principle at enforcing regulations, because rather than going through the process, these are regulatory scientists who have now retired, by the way, so they kind of realized the futility of what was going on. You just work with lawyers and sue the hell out of a company until they either go bankrupt or change their approach. So you have some some of these zebras are actually not quite zebras. They're more wolves in zebra clothing. And they all go once a year to this town called Davos. Yeah, I think I'm going down a rabbit hole here, but anyway. But the and a lot of people in the finance community now are looking at what's happening to industry and going, "Gosh, that seems pretty horrible." We don't want to be associated with these groups. And so they're working now with a lot of the NGOs, funding them as well, which terrifies me, to run campaigns to basically, it's sort of like a messianic approach to say that we are going to save industry. And so what we've seen, from many people who act, and you talked about this sort of definition of capitalism. Most of the people who are, the brain children behind these campaigns are actually anti-capitalist. We're seeing a rise of a new type of socialism. I've actually referred to it as foundation capitalism. It's another approach, but and that's a very scary transition that we're seeing now. That we don't need manufacturing, we don't need consumer products. We have enough. It's time for some degrowth, some conscientious capitalism, which I'm still trying to understand what that means. And it's created now a different type of stakeholder relationship. Most industries are not allowed. The WHO basically is going to push from their first conference in May on the non-communicable diseases high-level meeting, what would be a development of what they call the commercial determinants on health, commercial being all corporations. We're not.
What does that mean?
Well, what that means is that they've determined, when they talk about a non-communicable disease, that means something that didn't come from a virus. So cancer, kidney disease, lung or respiratory diseases, diabetes. Their view is all of these diseases are caused by industry. Point. We wouldn't have any of these diseases. Have the food corporations trying to make us fat, or the chemical industry poisoning us with plastics and pesticides, or the tobacco or the vaping community, and alcohol. So you begin to see the view is what they managed to create at the FCTC, the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, where tobacco companies are no longer allowed to. You cannot even talk to someone who's talked to somebody in the tobacco industry. So they've isolated them. What they want to do, and they've been very clear on that, is do that to all industries. Well, they refer to them as health harming industries. And the health harming industries, when I started to look, include the pharmaceutical industry, by the way. So nobody in the WHO could speak to anybody in the pharmaceutical industry. During the monkeypox or mpox crisis, there was the Bavarian Nordic was the only company that had a vaccine for mpox. And the head of the WHO region, African region, acknowledged during an interview that she had no contact at all with the only vaccine maker that could help them during the crisis. Then she's not allowed.
So I understand the idea that you want to keep at least some arm's length to prevent the sort of accusations arising that there's undue influence from certain vested interests to get governments to support certain things so that they can make money off of it. I get that. But to then say, well, we can't talk to them at all, that's absurd. That, like, there needs to be some way that that kind of communication can take place. And I think this is somewhat related to what you talked about regarding the plastics treaty at the UN, where the NGOs don't want the petrochemical industry engaged in the talks about how best to do plastic recycling or being involved in any way with this plastics treaty. And it's the same thing with health. It's the same thing with oil and gas. At the climate talks, the UN climate talks, they don't want the NGOs get so upset when the oil and gas industry shows up, when they're talking about rules that affect the operations and existence of the oil and gas industry. So it seems to me that the NGOs take a page out of the tobacco playbook for all of these different industries. And it comes down to something that you mentioned where it's about degrowth, about a whole society transformation, and how what's the best way to achieve that. And the NGOs seem to be better positioned to make that happen. And so how do we get some more reasonable voices engaged in that conversation?
Well, I mean, this is the one thing that I referred to earlier when I said the hypocrisy is rich here. You can't have people from industry involved in anything. The main architect at the WHO, just as an aside, on the consumer determinants on health, was the former director from the Brussels-based umbrella health organization known as EFA, the Environment and Public Health Alliance. So you take a activist who had been campaigning in Brussels, and you give her a position and a budget at the WHO and tell her, okay, we want you to continue doing what you want to do. So the UN bodies now have been weaponized by the activist community. And the plastics treaty, like you mentioned, is a good example of where the NGOs had a strategy and a campaign, and they wanted to use this UN body, which was sort of loosely tied to the UN Environment Program, but hopefully they are hoping to create it into its own body, a bit like the biodiversity movement, which was part of the IUCN for quite a while, another quasi administrative NGO. So what you get in the end is they're saying we can't have industry involved, and industry's everywhere. Well, I actually interviewed somebody from who went to the plastics conference, and basically said this was ridiculous. I mean, there were some people obviously who were tied to governments like the Saudi or the Emirati government, because there the big industries are government owned.
Yeah.
So it's a hard thing to say, is this person an industrialist or is he a member of the government and member of the cabinet? So by saying that that's where industry is involved, well, it's hard to draw a line in these countries. But if you count through the delegates, and they had this big report about 220 industry people, including all these people from these large government delegations in the Middle East, there were over 2,200 activist groups, and some groups I had no idea what they were possibly doing there. These widows and children's groups in Africa, which I must have got funding somewhere to travel. But they've never said the word plastic on any of their materials, and don't have the budget clearly to run something like this. So it became absurd at a certain point how they will work to keep industry out, but anybody and their dog could show up if they said they were an NGO. And where is this coming from? How is this possible? You mentioned, should there be some reason or rationality? We first need some transparency. We demand transparency from industry. An industry person is a lobbyist. An activist who's doing the same thing, no, they're an advocate. And we don't have, we can trust them because they're a watchdog. And we can not only trust them, we also tolerate a lot more from them. If I have a watchdog, my watchdog's there to protect me. If my dog barks at the moon 99 times out of 100, I will tolerate that and that level of error, because that one time out of 100 when the dog barks at a mad cow or something like that, good boy. And so we have a different threshold of acceptance If an NGO makes a mistake, it's not a problem. They have a campaign and they're wrong, and then this campaign gets amplified in the media, and everyone gets scared and stops using a beneficial product. Okay, I was wrong. Sorry. Well, no, they won't even say that. But if an industry person makes a mistake one time out of a million, no, we can't have that. And I'm sometimes amazed at how well and how efficient industry can be. I used to have meetings on top of an ethylene cracker, where just one little spark would create a hole the size of the city that we were in. And I was sometimes amazed that it never happened, to be quite honest, when you think about it. And efficiency and control of industrial processes to not make mistakes. But that one time in a million that does happen, we never hear the end of it. But NGOs make 99 times out of 100 mistakes like that watchdog, and we promote them, we fund them, we thank them. There's no rationality here.
Excellent points. In terms of the health effects issue, it's really interesting to me where the first step was that the emissions are causing all of these terrible things to happen on Earth. So in order to stop climate change, we need to do all of these different things to control what's happening in society. But now that that's sort of wearing off a little bit, there's a shift now to look at things through a health lens. And there's a group in Canada called the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, and they push a whole lot of different things they're funded by certain foundations, the kind of usual suspects in Canada. And they promote legislation to ban fossil fuel advertising, to produce and support studies that I would put in scare quotes because they're not really studies. They're funded by these foundations to arrive at a certain conclusion, really terrible parameters within the study, and all these different kinds of things. And I noticed in some of your writings, you talk about these kind of what I would call astroturf studies that don't, they're meant for a certain purpose. And so then you see this body of literature building up that is really terrible in terms of scientific or scholarly inquiry, but they're being held as an example and to justify certain regulatory and policy positions in order to say, well, your health is at risk in a city where there's cars, there's higher instances of asthma, or if you use a natural gas stove, there's higher cases of asthma. And they're all correlative rather than looking at other explanations and so on. So I find it fascinating to see what you've written about these different kinds of things, because it goes through lots of different types of industries. And it's like all industry is bad. What's the target today? The target's oil and gas, the target's the chemical companies, the target is food companies, agri-food. So how can people sort of push back against that to sort of, is it possible to get those studies retracted so that they're not used by governments and they're not used in litigation? What's the solution?
I mean, it's what's happening is there's so many things at the same time that are changing the way we understand and approach these things. First point I want to make very clearly, and it's painful to have to keep saying this, and read someone like Bjorn Lomborg, and you can see he's relentlessly trying to remind people as well. Look, people, the world is getting better. I mean, I worked in I had to articulate the concept of product stewardship. I did communications for the product stewardship unit within the chemical industry for a while. Product stewardship means a continuous improvement phase. So the first discovery will be a little bit crude and have some side effects, but you continually improve it and make it better. And that's what has been happening. Our air has been massively improving, our use of energy efficiency. If we look at the state of the world today compared to what it was 50 years ago. And this has nothing to do with NGOs. This has to do with product stewardship, with companies continually innovating and making their products better. And they have to, because if they don't innovate, they don't survive. That's basic rule of any industrial company. So how is it possible then that with all of these great improvements in pollution, waste management, that we suddenly begin to see that everything in the world is going in the wrong direction? Well, put together several things that have happened in just one generation. And I think we haven't really been able to see the impact of the internet yet. This may be a little bit of a sidestep, but I'm going to come back because we really have to understand what has been happening under the surface. The internet started to have an impact on people around the turn of the century, around the millennium. And so we started. Climate change was, I think, the first internet science debate. Science debates have gone on since basically since scientists began in the to become a field in the 1400s. But whereas it used to be a group of scientists at the Royal Institution, hating Newton and everything else, and having these fights. They always have fights. It became more public with climate change, and with the internet, suddenly anybody could put the word climate into their URL, and they became an expert on climate change as well. So and at the same time as the internet changed the publishing business for news, and we no longer had newspapers, it also changed the publishing approach for journals, and scientific journals in particular started to struggle because the universities weren't going to pay the high prices anymore. People were no longer looking at the models that they had for peer reviews and finding any value in it. And so you started to see different models. They had the green model and the gold model or the standard for the publishing. Open access to research became important as well. But then you also had the pay-to-play or predatory journals that will just take anything that you pay $3,000 for, and you can publish it. And that's where a lot of these publications were going. I think Seralini's rat study, which was retracted by I think that was probably the best example. It was retracted one day in one journal. He just went and put it in another journal, and it's still being referenced there. So you have publishing that they still claim that they're peer reviewed, but I refer to as P reviewed, where you get a couple of your friends together and then you just piss on the reputation of science by how you do that. So you now can declare that you have a scientific study that says, and then just choose whoever is behind the interests that you want to promote. And you begin to see that once again, the quality, there's too many academics out there. I mean, when I left the academia, I was like, I'm not going back. It's just, there's too many academics with nothing to do. And they still have this concept that if you publish enough articles, you're going to get promoted, and nobody reads your articles. The impact factors are usually below 1. There's no references or citations. I believe 50% of all publications in the scientific journals now have not been read. And so not even by the authors who published them. So you begin to see that you've created a meaningless base for expertise. Now, sorry, that's a bit of a side topic to get back to what's happening with these new groups coming. Well, next thing you do is like anyone who's been a lobbyist in either Ottawa, Washington, or Brussels will know one key rule: follow the money. And who's behind the money is going to tell you as well where the next policy issues are going to rise up. A lot of these scientists, I tend to find that they associate themselves very politically now. I mean, groups like Ramazzini Institute are just particularly awful. I think I mentioned in a recent article that anyone from Ramazzini should be excluded from all other scientific communities on the basis of scientific integrity. But these groups will follow the money. So endocrine disruption was a very big field, very lucrative. You could get your postdocs to get studies for until they became until your retirement anyway, on endocrine disruption. And suddenly people stopped worrying. It became what I refer to as banalized. It became banal. A little bit like how we used to be afraid of dioxins. Now it's like, okay, where there's smoke, there's dioxins, no big deal. But that money ran out, so a lot of the scientists migrated into fields like pesticides. And
Yeah.
so you start to see all this funding for pesticide research, no more funding. And some of them bring endocrine disruption into pesticides as well. But so they were chasing where the next funding for their postdocs was going to be. And it didn't matter what they were publishing. It mattered that they were procuring funding, either government funding or foundational funding or whatnot. Now, okay, we're noticing now suddenly food cases coming up. There's a lawsuit now against around 8 main food companies for ultra processed food, essentially creating poisons. They were likened to the tobacco industry. Notice the playbook coming in again. And in fact, the tobacco companies owned some of the food groups in the 80s. Haha, I told you. So, so now there's all these studies coming out on ultra processed food. And it's like, wow, okay, what is ultra processed food? Well, we don't really know. We don't really have a definition. People think any processing of food is a bad thing. And so pasteurizing milk is processing it. And you're destroying the natural goodness of milk by pasteurizing it. How dare you? We want raw milk. And as we're beginning to see, he who shall not be named is going to be the next head of Health and Human Services. He's a raw milker. And so you're beginning to see that people are reacting out of fear and stupidity. And of course, they don't have the access to really reliable, trustworthy, accurate information, but the journals are full of articles. And so what we're beginning to see now is that a lot of the scientists coming out of tobacco, where the funding dried up on a lot of tobacco initiatives, because, well, we solved that problem. They're now going into food, and they're likening exactly something like ultra processed food as a poison, like the tobacco industry was doing with nicotine. And we're getting these kids addicted to a life of chronic illness, therefore. So the food industry has been tobacconized. Pesticide industry has been tobacconized. They're gone. Follow the money. What's next? Where's the next, who's the next zebra for tomorrow's meal? What you get in the end is these reports, and these scientists then all come together in organizations like the UN. IARC is a wonderful example where they're the only sort of quasi-scientific body to say glyphosate was a risk. Essentially, the toxicity levels are so low on glyphosate, you could, like people say, you could drink it. It's less toxic than the main ingredients you find in cookies. But they were actually funded by the tort lawyers. I showed how Chris Portier was working with law firms, and he was a late add-on to the IARC monograph meetings, and his main job was to deliver one sentence, which is glyphosate is a probable carcinogen. And the minute that happened, and these are all Ramazzini connected scientists there, by the way. The minute that happened, the lawsuits against Monsanto, well, once again, that's the approach. Put them, sue the hell out of them until they either stop, producing, in this case, not glyphosate. Glyphosate was never their interest. It was GMOs. But if you can't have a herbicide tolerant seed, then you've created, you've removed the market for GMOs, essentially. So they did the same thing. Same playbook again comes in, again out of Ramazzini on aspartame. Instead of Monsanto as a big bad demon, you have to have one company that you focus on. And 9 companies produce glyphosate. It doesn't matter, just Monsanto. You have Coca-Cola. And the strategy, again, was to go to IARC, get them to say aspartame is a carcinogen, and then all the law firms will start suing, and that creates you create an enormous amount of revenue coming in. When Bayer, which bought Monsanto, settled out of court for $11 billion. Did that 11 billion go to the plaintiffs, the 100,000 plus plaintiffs? No, very small amount maybe did as a administrative fee. A lot of it went back into feeding into the research and political approaches for the next great target. The only sad thing for this project is aspartame. Aspartame was also being assessed by another agency, and they didn't agree with each other. One was risk-based, others hazard-based, long program. So there's money coming from the tort law firms. You got 11 billion, you can buy any science you want and publish it anywhere. You pay NGOs. NGOs will do the work for free, but you give them a little bit of money, they'll do exactly what you want. There's an enormous amount of money sloshing around in these groups now. Before, you used to think of NGOs as poor organizations, basically, ringing bells or having these little donation urns on the sides of the street. That doesn't exist anymore. What we also saw, I told you it was going to be a long answer, but so many things were happening at the same time. What we also saw was a massive wealth creation in the last 25 years. Go back to basically the 1920s, when we were in the last period of an enormous wealth creation. I don't want to talk about a Great Depression following after anything. Right? But so in the 1920s, we had, from that mass wealth creation, an enormous number of extremely wealthy people who set up foundations: Carnegie, Ford, Rockefeller, all of these businesses. They created these long-standing foundations that used to give money to people for university programs. They set up hospitals. They created these, they helped developing countries to survive, prevent famines. And these foundations were in a rather, they supported artists. This was what philanthropy was for about 100 years. In the last 25 years, we have had 4 equivalent wealth creation movements. You've had the internet, and so you had people like Bill Gates suddenly, and a lot of billionaires came out of the internet. Social media, people like the Zuckerbergs as well. So and so social media was the second great wealth creation. We now have the whole AI movement and the crypto movement. And crypto billionaires, if anyone wants to know about the power of the crypto billionaires, just take a look at the last elections in the US. Basically, the crypto people felt that they weren't getting their fair share, so they just put their money behind any candidate who was going to be positive towards crypto. They got their money back, by the way, since the election. But it's just, I can't imagine these people living in their parents' basements, just basically clicking away, going, "Who shall we support next?" But you can't make this shit up. But but you've got these billions sloshing around, and there is this giving pledge, of course, that these billionaires have to give away their money, but they don't really know what to do. So you've created this new type of business around foundations. And the foundations themselves are becoming, there's a certain sort of ecosystem that's grown out of them. These consultants now are very good at taking just a small percentage off of the billions that are going around, but they're doing okay with that. And so you have things like, if you look at what Sam Bankman-Fried did, they somehow lost $8 billion of Alameda Research's money, but they didn't lose it. They gave it away. They gave it away to anybody and everybody. And Sam Bankman-Fried was very active in a group called Effective Ventures, which talked about effective altruism, which meant that it created an industrialization of giving. that you could, and you can make more, and then you can give more, and this is the approach. And he really liked this idea, and he seemed to have access to a lot of other people's money, and so if you look at how much they've been giving, and they get these teenagers, there's been cases, I think Time has reported on sexual abuse of these kids that they send to Silicon Valley to learn all about effective giving. And apparently there's been some really horrible abuse situations, but it's created a donor culture. I mean, OpenAI, which is part of ChatGPT, was founded as a nonprofit, and there was a real debate about whether they could continue as a nonprofit. They have such an anti-industry mindset. But what are they doing with their money? Well, I mean, groups like US Right to Know or Environmental Working Group have received lots of money through different channels, through these foundations that they're now spending for their own scientific research that they publish in these journals I talked about. So
Yeah,
it all goes around.
it's all interconnected, for sure.
Meanwhile, and this is where the foundations are getting quite sophisticated. There's no transparency here, because they're giving to these poor students, or they're giving to the arts and the cultures. Who could possibly think the foundation's doing anything malicious? And so but they've created certain tools. One of them is a donor advised fund, which means a foundation will take money from one person and earmark it for an organization that they, which of course has to fit within the foundation's views. And I started to realize just how non-transparent this was when I was a victim. There was a film where there was about 30 seconds in the film where I was personally attacked. And I mean, I was sitting there in the cinema watching this film as my websites are going across the screen. Funny thing was, the only thing I really thought of is I really have to try and improve the graphics on my website. It didn't look good on a big screen. But anyway, I digress. The film was funded by this organization called the Utah Film Center, which is a very small organization, which seems to move a lot of money from one hand to another, because they're a donor advised fund. So I contacted them and said, listen, I've been maligned in this film. Can you please, I want to know who's funding it. And the film was called Into the Woods. It was about how the tort law firms took on David and Goliath story against the big bad Monsanto. And what I thought was interesting there was they talked about how, evil industry is for funding all these programs and everything. Well, this was the tort law industry was funding this film. But they refused to tell me the names of the organizations that were funding to protect the anonymity of the donors. So foundations can do this, and you can get money from any interest group.
Yeah.
And do a research study. So that's one thing. The second thing is a fiscal sponsor. Foundations may sometimes be involved with activist campaigns that may bloody their reputation a little bit. Certain things they're not supposed to do ethically. So they get a fiscal sponsor, which is not an NGO, it's some consultant who will organize donations from a large number of foundations to do the things that they think are necessary, but a little bit on the ugly side. One of the fiscal sponsors I looked at was an organization that was paying journalists to essentially report on climate change. And you begin to realize how much money was being given to journalists who, of course, were struggling because the media, as part of the internet revolution that we've seen, it was no longer really a good means to support a living. And the alternative media was replacing it in many cases. Look what we're doing today. And so when so you can't really go and say, publicly that you're paying journalists to report on things you think are important. There's another fiscal sponsor. In fact, it was handed from one fiscal sponsor to another, and this is where it gets really interesting, where they're paying a tort law firm called Cher Edling. These two people are actually never been lawyers. They've been activists all their lives until they set up this law firm. Cher Edling only exists to sue fossil fuel companies for the damages of climate change, alleged damages. And so they're never going to win a case because it's rather hard to say that you lost your home or that the infrastructure was destroyed because of the fossil fuel industry. But they're essentially there to create what they're called climate nuisance suits, to continually have them in the courts, destroy their reputation, link fossil fuel companies with climate change. So they're never going to win. But, I tend to notice that these tort lawyers, they need to keep their Gulf Streams gassed up. They need their private jets. They need their life. And foundations have paid them through a fiscal sponsor. So it's not clearly put on that's theirs. More than 12 million, at least this is what the US Senate reported in their investigation, more than 12 million to Cher Edling with no results. But I started to, every time I hear the word Cher Edling, my ears kind of peek up, and I start to look, and it's a god awful organization. I mean, it's Naomi Oreskes is this evil genius behind half these organizations, like Climate Accountability Institute and others, has been a consultant for Cher Edling, basically. They've been paying off a lot of their sort of celebrity people they want to keep actively involved using foundation money. But since the foundations obviously, that doesn't look good on them, they're hiding behind this veil of non-transparency. So lots of money floating around. Systems changed. Yeah, of course we're in chaos.
Yeah, and you mentioned the Tides Foundation earlier. They were one of the first ones to embark upon those donor-advised funds, and it was back in, I think, 2011, where they had the tar sands campaign, where they had created this system in order to get these donor-advised funds that were given specifically to environmental NGOs to attack the oil sands companies in Canada, and very successful. And when Vivian Krause started to investigate through the charity tax receipts or whatever in the United States and started calling attention to it, eventually they changed their name. So they're no longer the Tides Foundation in Canada. They're called Make Way. So it's like turning the tide, but now make way for the new climate regime. And so they still do donor advised funds, and there's another group called the Environmental Funders Canada, where different organizations can funnel money in, then they give it out to other groups. And when there was a provincial inquiry run by forensic accountant Steve Allen in Alberta, trying to understand how these networks operated and everything, they found it was really almost impossible to track the money, because it goes from one group to another group, who then gives it to another group, who gives it to another group. And it's very difficult to determine exactly who gave money for which project, because the different environmental groups would have different campaigns and whatever. So then to try to parse out precisely what was given for a tar sands campaign was very difficult to do. And what was also interesting was that the Tides Foundation in their records would have the specific thing called tar sands campaign. But again, when Vivian Krause started making this public, they just took away the title. So it was really difficult then to find. They would just give it to a Canadian group and not necessarily specify the tar sands campaign, even though that group may have been using it for that purpose. And I want to just also link in what you talked about revolving doors, because in the United States in particular, there's been some research done by different organizations about the revolving door between the EPA and the various environmental groups in America, like Environmental Defense, like Sierra Club, and I forget what the other one is, the NRDC. Right. So they then they work for the environmental group. They do suing to settle. So they'll attack a certain regulation so that they can settle out of court and have a better regulation. And then those people come into the EPA. And once they've done a couple of years, they go back to an environmental group, or maybe they go work for a tort law firm. So there's all of these sort of weaving in. And I'm so glad that you mentioned this idea about this wealth and what to do with it. And to have, there's this idea that you can be moral and help with all these different things by funneling money to these great causes or whatever. So you have the Jeff Bezos Earth Fund, and maybe that's also a way to minimize criticism against what his company, the operations of his company. So there's a little bit of Danegeld in there, where I'll donate to a foundation because maybe they'll stop protesting in front of my building, or maybe there won't be the sort of shareholder attacks that come up at the annual meetings and so on. So, like you said, there's all of these different interconnections, whether it's how the evolution of how the money's funneled into these things, how it's utilized by the environmental groups to push a certain agenda. But what I would like to know ultimately is who is giving that money to the foundation and what's their end game, because a lot of the sort of things that we're seeing with the agri-food sector, the way I see that is that it's the longer term goal is is to support what the EU policy is, which is to have most of the food produced organically, and to take, if it's not if the land isn't for organic production, it has to be set aside for nature or something, and to change how those agri-food practices happen. And all of these different cases, removing chemicals, doing these different things, lead to that later direction, which, or the ultimate goal, which is to have people with not enough food, because there's no way that organic production can feed as many people today as we have using what they would call industrial farming practices.
Oh, I mean, first thing before I get into your comment, your coverage of the Allen inquiry and the Alberta investigation about how they were essentially assaulted by these American foundations paying these small Canadian NGOs to basically block oil production in Alberta. That your reporting was excellent, and it actually inspired an article that I had written on it. But why don't people know about that? Why don't people know what's going on with these donor advised funds and how all this money is being, basically sponged up by these different groups and essentially there only to throw spokes in the wheels of, consumer goods and essentially this whole concept of progress, which nobody uses anymore. And what's behind this? Well, short answer is that the foundations are giving a lot of money to media now. And I think it was rather unique that I'd written an article on how the Guardian gets more than $200 million from foundations, and I just started listing them all. And essentially, they're buying ink, And you want to run a campaign, you fund an NGO, you fund a newspaper, and you connect the activist journalist that you have doing this investigative report on what your NGO is doing, and you have the journalist, and it's you pay them. They get paid by the foundation, they get paid by the NGO, they get paid by the news organization through this like Guardian.org, which is a charitable wing of the Guardian. That's bullshit. Sorry. But what happens now? Billionaires aren't really, most of these billionaires were sort of geeks who had no idea what to do with their money. It's not like the industrialists from the 1920s. So they just sort of put this money in. Hopefully it's going to shut up some people, but somebody else is managing it for them. And so you got these bottom feeders now, these consultants that are moving around. So when you talk about the Allen inquiry, how you couldn't even track it, because these people are all interconnected. But these aren't the billionaires. These are the administrators, the consultants who are very politically connected as well. And a lot of the, sorry to say this, a lot of the political agenda that's been set by the left, when they talked about the Democratic Party machinery that, was keeping Joe Biden basically in place over the last summer. People were wondering, what is this Democratic Party machinery we're talking about? Well, these are all the big organizations, the foundations that are behind a lot of the funding of the politics. So you're never going to see these tools change in America. The donor advised funds are going into a lot of political funding of groups through organizations that they would rather not have you know about. And the media as well doesn't really want you to know who's paying for the stories that you are considering news. So, and as long as we keep calling these people conspiracy theorists and everything else, then we can keep them on the edge. Well, these things are boiling over now as we're watching the new government administrators coming in the U.S., where all these conspiracy theorists now suddenly have levers of power. So it's going to be very curious, interesting 4 years to see what comes out. But there are also the noble foundation benefactors, people like Michael Bloomberg, for example. Michael Bloomberg never got to be president. He's quite bummed out about that, but he still has a place on the world stage because he funds a lot of UN programs. So every time there's a UN conference somewhere, he'll be given a day where they'll give him some sort of accolade, as I say, awards only money can buy. And he has and you look at something like the WHO, I think only 25% of the funding of the WHO comes from member states.
Yeah.
A lot of it is coming from foundations like Michael Bloomberg. And so if they decide that they want to declare all industry to be persona non grata in any government meeting, and the member states may object. The member states don't have much sway anymore in the decision process. They can be polite to the member states, but the real money is coming from foundations and what they call targeted programs. Targeted programs are programs funded by the foundations.
And there's a bit of a hierarchy with the foundations because I would describe them as the mega foundation funders. So they're the ones who they spend billions every year on different things. And then you can work your way down. And then there's ones that may not have as much money to throw around, but they still have a stake in the system. And it's interesting that you mentioned Bloomberg because he was behind the Beyond Coal campaign, and now he's on this one about banning plastics. So Beyond Plastic. So again, the Beyond thing. And, he was behind the creation of the We Mean Business Coalition, the C40 cities, the We're Still In coalition when Trump was in power the first time, you know, pushing this agenda amongst different things and putting his money there as well. But he also does the sort of traditional philanthropy that you're talking about, where he had invested, I think, quite a significant amount of money to Johns Hopkins University and their medical system. So it's interesting to see how these individuals connect to this broader ecosystem with the NGOs and the funding. And you have to ask yourself, so what's his ultimate goal? What does he want out of this? But I'd also like to just tie back a little bit about media, because you mentioned the Guardian Group, which is really fascinating because they claim they're above all of this kind of messy, dirty, accepting money for stuff. And they do have sponsored stories, which they, the sponsored aspect is always really tiny, and you can't tell that it is indeed really small. But there's also these other aggregate organizations. And I think the most influential right now is Covering Climate Now. And they have this entire apparatus of they get people to sign in and become members. Then they offer their support for member media organizations where they will help craft stories. They will help, like in Canada, there's a federal government initiative called the Local Journalism Initiative. And quite often that money is used to hire journalists for smaller news organizations to supposedly discuss more local news that's going on. But Covering Climate Now helps those local news journalists put climate in every story. This is how you do it. These are the kinds of phrases. They hold workshops. They do all these different kinds of things. And then there's Inside Climate News, and then there's some other ones as well. There's a UK version that's not as successful as Covering Climate Now. But I mean, it's quite, it, you know, disturbing to see that there's this sort of collusion of narrative construction that then gets filtered out through over 450 global news organizations. So when you look up a news headline, let's say that the president of the Club of Rome writes an op-ed and it's in the Conversation, or it's in one of the Brussels newspapers or something, or one of the Belgian ones, then if you Google that title, you'll see it amplified through 25 other publications around the world. And the same thing when Project Syndicate, which is something that's also, I think, funded by Bloomberg, but it's I think organized by Stiglitz, and they run all of these different op-eds. And then if you Google some of those titles, they too show up in 25 different, 30 different publications around the world. Amplification that takes place. So you have foundations that fund not only the journalists, but the different media ecosystem that puts out and amplifies messages around the world. And like you say, people don't really know about it. Why don't they know about it? For that reason.
The Covering Climate Now is actually one of the cases I didn't mention them precisely, but they're they're funded by a donor advised fund, and and you find the usual suspects: Oak Foundation, Bloomberg, all these groups, Rockefeller, seem to be behind all of them. And it's that there's a layer though of the movers and shakers, the consultants that are in the shadows that are working between these groups, and they can decide as well sometimes to shift one donor advised fund to another. And they're actually beginning to realize that it's a bit messy to have to work through an NGO, because these NGOs sometimes have these, drama queens in the head that have their own legacies and own approaches to do things. And so they're beginning to realize it's better to just put your own person in there, create an organization. Covering Climate Now was one of those cases. They're actually, I think, if I recall, 3 of the people on that organization are actually paid not by Covering Climate Now, but by the donor advised fund that's managing it. So you don't need to work with a foundation that's going to support journalists. You can create your own organization with hundreds of millions of dollars from foundation money. And so they're finding a new way, and they even say fiscal sponsors. Fiscal sponsors are more efficient than giving to an NGO, and because you can create a campaign immediately. And Covering Climate Now is the fiscal sponsor behind that is actually paying for the salaries of many of the people at the top of the organization. But you don't see that unless you go through their IRS filings. And those IRS filings are always fun. But who's going to look at that? Not the journalists, because they're going to find their names in there somewhere as well.
But do they get a tax write-off for that? If they're doing
this is all tax deductible. Sorry, I mean, I didn't even get into the whole financial mechanism. It's what I call foundation capitalism. If I have a legal problem and I've got to pay a lawyer, if I pay a lawyer, that's a business expense. But if the lawyer has a fund that they would like me to donate to in order to run a campaign to pay some scientists to, for example, do urine analysis of pregnant women in the heartland in the Midwest states, just a long-term plan, then I can claim a full tax deduction to give to this foundation. So the taxpayers are writing off probably 20 to 30% of all the money that's sloshing around out there. And
so
I get my legal services, but I don't have to pay the bill.
Right. So the governments in some cases actually pay for the NGOs, but the NGOs also get money from these foundations where it's tax-free. So really taxpayers are almost paying twice for it, because if those foundations and companies behind the foundations aren't paying tax, then that means there's less money to do things like social services that everybody says that they want covered. Yeah, that's Really interesting how that works. And
Well,
I'm
when
thinking,
when you don't have integrity, things are pretty easy to find a solution.
yeah, one way of
I
putting
tend
it.
to say most of these organizations are led by zealots, and ethics, honesty. They tend to be sociopathic. They're very good at what they're doing, very good at making people love them, but they don't have any moral compass. So and these are not the sort of people you want leading a lot or defining the narratives of our society today. They don't think about consequences to their actions if they decide to, reorganize the food chain. They're stuck on an ideology, and they'll do whatever they can. And if it means that I'm going to rob poor people of, government support so I can run a climate program, so I can win. It's about winning. It's not about saving the planet. Come on, let's be serious, Tammy.
Yeah, and the ends justify the means, right?
I,
Whatever that end
I
is.
always, you always lead me into these dark corners where you just want to cry after an hour of listening.
You
I'm
know,
generally very happy. I'm a happy person. I just want to let you know. Just shake my head at the stupidity all around me.
right. I'm optimistic too. Some people think that I'm pessimistic, but I'm not. I'm optimistic because if we don't talk about it, then people don't realize what's happening. And if you don't realize what's happening, you can't try to change the trajectory. And so I think that's what we're doing is we're trying to raise awareness so people can actually understand what's happening and do something about it. I'm thinking that we might have to do a second conversation about the climate disclosures. And you had mentioned before that you have two more parts coming. So maybe after you finish those two, we can talk about that whole segment. So far, I just want to tell the listeners that you've got these two fantastic pieces about the Carbon Disclosure Project and how these voluntary disclosures are being used to basically get oil and gas companies or hydrocarbon companies to ban themselves. And it just as a bit of a teaser that hopefully David and I can talk about in the new year is that uh, a, a few months ago, Terrence Keeley testified before the Senate. I think it was the Senate, maybe one of the parliamentary committees, one of the committees in Canada, and he was being asked about the disclosure standards that they want to mandate in Canada. And he said, look, I'm all for data. It, and lots of companies like to produce data, like to track data and everything. But in the end, what matters is what you do with it. And what are you doing with this data? You want all of the companies to report on their climate emissions profiles, tracking emissions through their value chain to collect all this data about transition risk and climate risk and all of this different stuff. What are you doing with that data? And I think people need to consider that question. What do you do the Carbon Disclosure Project, if you're an oil and gas company, especially a fairly large one, it's over 167 pages of stuff they're asking you about. It costs a lot of money to provide these disclosures, and then what happens with that data? What are you doing with it? Um, so, as a teaser, hopefully David and I will talk more about that. But if you could just comment a little bit before we conclude here.
There's lots of sort of onions that have skins that have to be peeled back. Each layer is just getting more and more rich, and you're beginning to realize as well the networks that were set up before the COP. I think it was in Paris in 2015. The behind the scenes movements, and they're coming up now to really pushing at a policy level. And I don't know in Canada if the debate was related to the similar legislation in the States, which is demanding that all procurement projects and all contractors must disclose their carbon emissions. And this was pushed, and behind the scenes, we're seeing documents by the Carbon Disclosure Project. So you begin to see how well placed they are in governments now, in politics. And I'm also looking at the money. I still have to get into the. It's not. Yeah, I think each submission each year is around $8,000 to $10,000, and they're getting, of course, you can see how many thousands of companies are complying to get their environmental badge. But the money itself is quite remarkable. And this is a lobbying organization. This is an activist group. But they're at high level, well connected, very well connected movers and shakers who got together before Paris and decided that the finance industry and the different investment funds should be the main drivers to this. There's money to be made in using this data for your own investment purposes, and nobody seemed to go to the SEC and say that this is kind of, you're getting advanced inside information here to make decisions. Instead, they call it environment, social, and governance.
Yeah.
So the whole sort of network that was going on underground is starting to come to the surface a little bit. And I'm trying to sort of, get some of the weeds that have been covering a lot of that information off. But it's very hard because it's very well disguised many times.
I'm so
I
grateful
need to
for your research into that, because it is, like you say, peeling an onion. But a lot of the research you've done already, identifying some of those funding streams, the how they use climate litigation in order to undermine the value of a company and so on. And now we're moving into this next phase, which is the disclosures, which of course are mandatory now in the EU to a crazy extent. But now with the new government in the United States, even though they were on that trajectory, I'll be curious to see if um, those requirements are now going to be dropped. So it'll be interesting what's going to happen in the new year, and I hope we have an opportunity to discuss the full uh, investigation that you're doing on the Climate Disclosure Project. I want to just add there that with the CDP, it's not just that they ask you for that data; they rank you, and the criteria that they use for ranking is a bit murky, and some
Yeah.
things are weighted differently than you might assume. And all there's S and I think Sustainable Fitch and S&P and a bunch of other, I think Bloomberg as well. They all have their own rating mechanisms. And so when they start to take this data and they want to rate and rank companies, what's their progress on emissions or social or governance or whatever, they all use different criteria for assessing whatever grade that they happen to give a company. So that kind of will tie into I hope our conversation in the new year.
And of course, the fund managers who pay more money to this NGO can get access to this data.
Right. And I think Bloomberg Terminal has um, a new something on there where they assess the ESG scores of different companies. And um, yeah, it's going to affect investment. It's going to affect how people get financing or companies get financing from banks, and all of these different kinds of things. There's quite large implications, and um, yeah, it'll be an interesting year to see how this turns out.
It's fascinating what a retired professor in his dusty basement in a non-fashionable part of a suburb of Brussels can pull up in his spare time. But if anyone listening to this podcast has information that they don't know what to do with, and maybe someone audacious enough to publish and comment on the information may be beneficial, I hope, Tammy, you put my contact details somewhere on your podcast page.
Absolutely. So in the show notes, I'll have links to the Firebreak and your work and some of the other things that we've been talking about. I'm wondering, you're the editor of the Firebreak, so are there other people who contribute to or put
Well,
posts on there?
what happened is I'd been writing for about 15 years under the name The Riskmonger. And everything on the Riskmonger page was my own material. And I started to realize I was getting too deep into the concepts. A lot of times my so-called articles or blogs were starting to be 10, 12 pages long. And most people that interesting stuff, but I just don't have time to sit down and read all this. But as you can see, putting the pictures together was not easy. So I created another organization called the Firebreak, which was meant to be, what a firebreak does is it's a risk management concept to control a fire by essentially using fire. And the idea was that I would write shorter journalistic articles, but I would also invite other people to contribute. So whereas the Riskmonger was my own sort of personal academic space, the Firebreak became more of a journalistic place to report on how the NGOs, foundations, and media are working together. And there, I think we've had, I think in the last year, about 10 contributors, other contributors, and they're listed. Information's available on them. And I would like to invite people if they want to publish or also reprint something that the Firebreak has on Substack, a fairly good following, slowly building it up on these subjects. And so the idea being that I'm a curator of the downfall of Western capitalism. I guess that's probably, I just basically, I curate all the details. So sometime in future, some people will actually have a copy of that. But the Firebreak is meant to be a more active approach to try to stop a lot of the bullshit that's going on. So please
Well,
contribute as well.
well, that's awesome. I'll put a link to all that in the description, and I hope that people take you up on that offer. The more people speaking on these things, different perspectives, the better. So thank you, David, for taking your time today to speak with me, and I really hope we can do this again in the new year to talk about climate disclosures.
Okay, thanks. It's great talking with you, Tammy, and have a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.
You as well. Thank you.